Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. It's Monday, and it's fine for me to finally get this Dr. Mundo rework review out. This has given me plenty of time in order to sort of play him. His release date was a little awkward for my normal timing, so it's at the very least, it's given me more time than usual in order to try him out and sort of give him a look. Now, to be fair, I have not tested him in the jungle at all, as these changes are mostly targeting Dr. Mundo to be reliable in the top lane and didn't really target his jungle presence at all. In fact, that was one of the hotfix buffs he received, was specifically jungle-oriented. Right, want him playable in the jungle, but that to not be his primary role, and in all honesty, I can see why they would consider that, so if you guys have played him in the jungle and that affects how anything I talk about today goes, let me know all that down in the comment section below. You guys have more experience with that than I do, as I almost exclusively played him top lane, but I will say, generally speaking, I have been a big fan of Dr. Mundo in the top lane, at the very least. It feels like his new kit has a ton of different ways to be played, a ton of different ways to outplay opponents, and in general is a lot more healthy. Now, I feel like one of the biggest issues I had with old Dr. Mundo is just his ability to show skill expression was so limited, and that hasn't really changed in the rework, but at the very least, he is now a simple champion with some degree of being able to outplay and at least a little bit more room for that skill expression, whereas before he just absolutely was a stat check champion. There was no way of outplaying Dr. Mundo other than dodge his spammable, low cooldown, refunding ability, right? That was essentially all you could do to outplay Dr. Mundo, and so the new one I feel like has a little bit more ways of actually being able to play around him. So overall, that's a much bigger buff for Dr. Mundo. And speaking of big buffs here, Mundo's new passive is Bonkers. This ability allows him to just lock so many champions out of being able to meaningfully interact with him while his passive is active. Obviously, if you're able to poke it off of him and then contest the canister, then he doesn't get that cooldown reduction. So for the next minute or so, at the very least at early levels, Dr. Mundo kind of has to play safe because he doesn't have a real passive at that point. He's taken 7% current HP, so, he feels kind of bad about that. But generally speaking, just the ability to ignore a single crowd control ability is super huge. I've talked a little bit before about how this gives him an in against ranged champions with appeal ability, things like Vayne Condemn or Quinn Vault, right? Dr. Mundo can just kind of ignore those and keep running them down, but it also works so well against a ton of melee champions he's going to play against as well. Obviously, you guys are seeing the Singed tier top lane, who is kind of hosed, because how do you deal with a Mundo who can't get flung into your Mega Adhesive, who's just totally immune to that ability, right? Like, that's a huge deal. But even if you consider other champions that can play top lane, things like Darius Apprehend or Mordekaiser Death's Grasp, those abilities, they want to try and bring you closer to them so they can set up a trade on their terms. Dr. Mundo just kind of ignores that. Champions that want to dash into you and CC you while they're dealing damage and then get away scot-free with things like Pantheon Shield Bash or Renekton Ruthless Predator, Dr. Mundo ignores that too, so he's able to trade back on these squishier champions while they're trying to hit someone without getting hit back, right? So that's a big deal for Dr. Mundo. Like, the ability for him to just straight up ignore crowd control is such a big deal. I cannot express this enough. Obviously, there is counterplay to it. He takes a ton of damage if he does ignore CC, so it's not free for him at all. He doesn't want to be eating crowd control if he can help it, right? This isn't something where he just like walks into skill shots because he's like, whatever, I'll just heal off of this. He does take a ton of damage, and canisters aren't always contestable. I've had them drop over walls from where I was and not been able to get to them, or behind a minion and then not be able to sort of get on top of it. Like, there is enough of a way to play around it to the point where Mundo doesn't want to just be taking skill shots willy-nilly, but it does mean that if he positively needs to avoid crowd control, he can do that in a way that I feel like is outplayable. If you're Darius, for example, and you reach out with an Apprehend just to poke his passive off, and then your jungler shows up while he doesn't have passive, right, that's a kind of play you can make. Or if you're a champion that's fortunate enough to have multiple forms of crowd control, something like Ornn being able to maybe even poke it off with something like a Q slow, and then when the pillar pops up, it boops Mundo, so he loses his passive, and then you go in for the E, right? Like, there are a lot of ways I feel like champions have of interacting with Dr. Mundo's passive in a healthy way, but at the same time, if you don't have a way of interacting with it, so, for example, you're Nami, and you're running for your life, and you try to tidal wave Mundo, and he just keeps coming, that's a huge deal. And there are some situations where Mundo doesn't care about the damage he takes. He just wants to be able to get on top of you and finish the job, or he knows he's got enough sustain to just kind of keep going. Like, it's a huge ability, and it's the #1 thing about Dr. Mundo's new kit. Now, What I will say is the rest of his base kit took some nerfs to compensate for such a powerful passive, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but generally speaking, the ability to ignore crowd control effects on a Juggernaut is a huge deal, and realistically, that's what Dr. Mundo is. He's a huge stat stick, he has trouble getting in, but once he's there, whoo boy does he do damage. Obviously, his cleavers kind of help him get there and stick there, but the biggest thing is how Blunt Force Trauma works and how much damage it gives him. I've been going a very aggressive fighter base build with Divine Sunderer, and that thing does like 400 damage on a low health E Sheen proc. Like, you just straight up kill squishies with that ability, which is crazy good, and especially when you then combo it with his ultimate, which gives him percent bonus AD on top of that, and Dr. Mundo is just dealing an absolute ton of damage while being very durable and having a bunch of sustain. I talked a little bit about it already, but his new R, I think, is much healthier for the game and a lot better for Mundo as well, because there's a little bit more skill expression to it and is a little bit more weighted as a go button rather than a sustain button. You can still press it in lane just for the healing, but the healing over time is like nowhere near as good as it used to be. So if you're really expecting to be able to just drop back in the lane, press R and wait for yourself to heal back up, you'll be a little disappointed with that particular performance, but it's much better as a way to not only heal bait people by being able to press R at an unexpected moment and gain 20% max HP back, right? That's sort of a big heal out of nowhere, but also as a go button, like I said before. You can kind of press this as a fight breaks out, regain a bunch of HP that you might have lost as you were getting poked at, and then you have the bonus movement speed to help run people down, you have a ton of bonus AD to deal damage, and you have that sort of continuous sustain in the background that's keeping you topped up and a little bit healthier than you would ordinarily be. If you consider it to be more like set passive and how that works, how it's not really a ton of visible health sustain, but you sort of notice that you're not dying as quickly as you might be otherwise because you have all this health sustain coming back at you. That's realistically more of where Dr. Mundo's new R is at, so that's a really nice change, I think, to the ability's usability as a whole. The other hilarious thing about Blunt Force Trauma is it does work exactly the way I was expecting it to, which I didn't think it would work this way, but it does whack away champion corpses if you kill them with it. So it does mean that it has the usability that I expected, where you can knock away a Scion for the last hit, and then his zombie spawns in a place that's not very good for him, or whack away a Karthus so Karthus can't hit you with that E damage right off the bat. Like, there's some kind of funny interactions. The biggest thing, though, is whacking away a champion after you kill them. Like, be gone, I don't need you anymore. It's really, really funny, and it's one of the best parts of new Dr. Mundo, if I'm being completely honest. I think it's absolutely hilarious. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the bad things, because the Mundo rework did come with some slight nerfs for Dr. Mundo. Like I said before, being able to ignore CC is a huge, huge deal, and that did eat up a big portion of Dr. Mundo's power budget. So if you're in a situation where you cannot proc the CC immunity effect, if that's not useful for you at all, then you feel like you're playing old Dr. Mundo, but with all of his abilities nerfed, which is kind of sad, and especially means that Gwen, for example, who's starting to become a staple of top lane, has an amazing matchup into Dr. Mundo, because not only does she do percent max HP damage, but she has no crowd control at all, or at least crowd control that Dr. Mundo can ignore, and therefore Dr. Mundo just feels like he's old Dr. Mundo with nerfed abilities, right? R doesn't give him as much sustain, his E doesn't give him as many free stats, he doesn't have Burning Agony for that tenacity. Like, there's a lot of things that just make Dr. Mundo feel really sad if he's in a situation where his passive is not useful at all. So hilariously, a lot of top lane matchups where you have no crowd control, you're actually better into Dr. Mundo than other champions that do have some form of hard CC, because at least they have, they have this mini game to play and this ability to say, well, I have to poke this off first before I can go for a trade, and that's sort of something that you don't have to worry about if you're Gwen or Kayle, or even someone like Nasus, who doesn't have any hard CC but can still wither Dr. Mundo. Like, there are some kind of fun gameplay interactions there that make Mundo feel a little sad if he's in those sort of matchups. The other thing about Dr. Mundo is his new W is a bit of a letdown. I was really excited for Heart Zapper because I felt like that's where a lot of his sort of skill expression was going to come from, being able to properly manage taking enough damage in order to gain a bunch of gray health, letting yourself get low for bonus damage from your E, and then at the last second popping it to regain a ton of health in order to finish off the fight that you're in. Like, that was something I was really excited to do, and it just doesn't work that way in practice. There are a couple of times I've gotten a clutch last second heal off of it in order to gain just enough health to close something out, but the sort of swinginess that I was expecting isn't there. I was really expecting Dr. Mundo to take a bunch of damage, but then to gain a bunch of health back from his W, and that's not really how that ability works. I've tried second maxing it, but it just doesn't still function in that form, because you only store 45% of the damage you take at maximum. So even if you're dumping all of your points into it at the start, which I think is a mistake because Cleaver is so good, you're sort of still in a situation where you feel a little bit bad about the healing you're getting from that ability. The damage is completely irrelevant. I can't think of this ability doing hardly anything in the middle of a fight. It's mostly there for the sustain, but the sustain isn't very good, so I just am unsure how to use this ability appropriately, which is a bit of a letdown for me because I was really excited with the gameplay that should have been possible with Heart Zapper. Maybe it'll get buffed in the future. I kind of hope it does, but generally speaking, I'm a little let down by how that ability is supposed to function, especially when you consider Dr. Mundo's old W and the sort of wall of stats it gave him, and instead he's left with this sort of pale imitation of his old W that, yeah, maybe will give you some health back, but the percent conversion, especially at 1 rank, is just so bad, and it feels like you want to max your Q first, and then you probably want to max your E, especially if you go for a more fighter-oriented build like I do. So that sort of leaves Heart Zapper as a bit of a wasted 1-point wonder that just doesn't really do a lot for you, which is kind of a sad thing to think about, and it is a bit of a letdown, especially when I was considering this ability as the one way in which Riot were going to inject more gameplay into Dr. Mundo's kit, more ability for him to have some skill expression. Because of this, I don't feel like Dr. Mundo is going to be very competitively viable, especially given what I just said about Gwen. Gwen is obviously a staple top lane pick. Viego is showing up a lot and does percent max HP damage and has the ability to sort of burst Mundo down before he can heal himself up too much. Like, there's a lot of just ways of dealing with him, especially at the meantime. Pros are also really good at chaining CC, so while Dr. Mundo may be able to not get picked, they also have very good ways of sort of playing around abilities like that and making sure that they can lock him down afterwards, and his sustain is just not there. He's not as durable as he used to be, even with his R ticking, so it means in general, I just don't think that fighters in general are very good right now in professional play, so he's not likely to see competitive play. But at the very least, I feel like he's very fun in casual play, and he definitely still is a simple champion, which is a good thing to have in the game because we do want some simple champions still. So either way, those are kind of my initial thoughts here on Dr. Mundo and kind of how he's been shaking out for me, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments. I know I've already talked a little bit about him in the jungle, and if you guys are playing him there, I'd love to hear about it, but definitely let me know if you've been playing him top lane, if you've been building tank or fighter, or how you guys have been dealing with him. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comment section below, or especially if you think he's super broken. I think he's actually in a fairly decent spot right now, not absurdly good, but also not absurdly bad. But if you guys think this champion is completely unbalanced, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments, so go ahead and leave those down there. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.